Winter 879. Rain beat down as the little coracles rode out of Ratlin. Iona was a day away in the calm, but in this, it could be longer. Sweat and rain fell into the faces of the men. Osrith too had an oar and was pulling with all her might as the salty blue-green northern sea drenched her for her efforts. Domhnall's leather-covered coracle was ahead. They had taken on pilots from Ratlin and were heading northeast, to Street Cuthbert's Isle. Iona. Once or twice, the swell of the currents pitched them forward. Constantine had nearly been thrown out, and had only been saved because his boot had landed between Osrith's own. After that, Tagged had lashed her to the mast, screaming over the howling gale that she was too light, and she may fall overboard. There would be no coming back from that churning, boiling sea. Osrith closed her eyes for the remainder of the journey, as the middle-aged monk who was guiding them picked up the strain. It had been madness to even consider such a crossing, the abbot at Ratlin had told Domhnall. But, considered he had, and pursued, St. Comesill's Isle being their resting place, when they would finally reach it. "Comesill will be with us all," he told them as they stood on a storm-soaked beach, the coracles knocking together as if they, too, were afraid. Osrith had closed her eyes. As Comesill was to the Gales, Cuthbert was to the Northumbrians. Tossed and soaked in the little vessel, Osrith prayed to their blessed saint. "The Danes and Norse are the best sailors in the world," Tagged had boasted that night, "except for the Irish." "What has Domhnall told you?" Constantine had asked, having woken her up in Ratlin's priory, the night before, where the warriors were sleeping. She had blinked a few times, in the darkness, having slept surprisingly well, and a feeling of pity entered her chest that she was still not asleep. "Are you frightened?" Constantine asked her. Osrith propped herself up on the blankets, which smelled of horse, considering those two questions. Constantine moved across, taking care not to wake Fergus or Tagged, and sat close enough to Osrith that she could feel his chest moving in and out. Osrith did not know how much he knew of her pregnancy, or loss, but she had heard Domhnall, on the morning before they left the Foyles coast, to the loud protests of denial from Constantine, tell him that he was to restrain himself, and now, side by side, he did not even touch her hand. "Frightened of what, Constantine?" Osrith asked. "About the plan. When we get to Dund." "After Domhnall's coronation?" Dund. Osrith knew of the place, though what it was, she did not know. It was Tara to the Gales of Dulreada, their capital, where coronations were held. "I don't know of any plan," Osrith told him, wondering about the place. "So how can I be afraid of what I don't know?" She had stared into the darkness at Constantine, wondering at his vague question. Was he about to tell her something? Dund was supposed to be mountainous, so she had an idea of a settlement with mountains like those in the Allied territory, gentle sloping mounds which made up the Morn Range. Ideal for Eochaid's snipers. She would fight. And Osrith suddenly felt happy. She knew, after everything, after her abortion, after Nine Fingers' attack, that she truly could. It had settled on her mind like as lightly as a butterfly might on one's hand. She was a warrior first, and no other life would fit for her. Frightened of what? She had asked again of the prince. But Constantine hadn't answered. The following morning, as she had pulled at the coracle's ashwood door, she felt joy again that her strength was returning, as if confirming the realization of the night before. But she needed to steel herself, like Bué, she needed to be Bué, and look after herself. If her own brute force was not enough, wit and guile must be employed. Osrith wanted to fight, and enjoy the wealth and comforts warriors enjoyed, wealth being the most vital, she knew, for she injured more often than if she had been a man. She could just choose to give up, be a servant, hide away, she supposed. Images of that day, on Loch Foyle's shore, still invaded her mind, but she had found that training, battle, even polishing the sword she had won, twice, drove the memories away. Osrith was a warrior, she knew that in her heart, and to fight was all she wanted for the rest of her life. And, should she ever go back to Aryan, means to support herself in pocket, she would seek out Nine Fingers and chop his cock off. In the darkness of the night before, Osrith suspected Constantine knew how she felt about fighting, for he wanted to know, "Will you continue to fight for Domnall?" While ignoring her question. "He is my lord, I am his warrior." Constantine said nothing more. It was strange, Osrith thought, when she was in his company, thoughts of finding a peace with herself rapidly came to nothing. Constantine had a way of challenging her decisions before she had even decided what they were. "You?" she added, as a storm in the making slammed noisy, energetic gusts around the stables, determined to make the most of being woken up. "Yes," Constantine replied. "We are to meet our allies, the Grigoyes, and we are going, with the Tara Stone to Dund, then Scone, with the Tara Stone." Then, he added, laconically, "We are going to fight Eochaid and kill Giric. Domnall says once Giric dies, Eochaid will renounce his claim to Pitland, to Scotland, and his son, Dyfnwal, will submit to him. And even if Eochaid doesn't, Domnall will still be crowned." It sounded like a sensible plan to Osrith. Muster as many allies as possible, win the heart of the people with a coronation, crowning MacAlpin's natural successor. Fight when the enemy suspects an attack least. Yet, from what Osrith had gleaned from their small encounter with Giric at Glashku, at Eochaid's palace, was that the man had weasel cunning. He was bound to have as many schemes half-built ready to be rolled out against Domnall at a moment's notice, to keep himself, through Eochaid's grandfather's claim, Saenid Mac Pin again, on the throne of Pitland. "What of Irian?" Osrith asked of Constantine. "Did Domnall say anything of Muir, and the princes and princesses?" In the darkness, she glanced over to the sleeping form of Domnall, who was now in exile. What would become of his family? Of Queen Muir if Don Shada decided to seize the throne and fight his father? Of little Neil Grubbyknees? "Once we have won, then Mary and Dira will be sent for," Constantine replied. But, that was not what Osrith had meant. Clearly, impending matrimony weighed on Constantine's mind. Then, he added, "Domnall thinks Don Shada will fight his father, in the end, for the southern lands, at least, if not the northern." Osrith sighed. Civil war was as terrible as war between mortal foes, if not more so. And they had the Norse needling them, for she was sure the policy of starvation would not keep them reined in for long. And, they were heading to another. Eochaid was their cousin through another sister of Muir and Constantine's father, and their grandfather, Saenid Mac Pin. His claim to Dalriada and Pitland could be argued as strong as that of either Domnall or Constantine. Domnall had spoken of a Dane who had taken some of Cumbraland's land, south of Caeligwylid, Hearthknut, and who had been slaughtered by Eochaid, his son captured and enslaved his daughter holed away at a monastery. Maybe incursions into Strathclyde were enough to distract Eochaid and give Domnall the edge. For, though there were only 6, if Eochaid's spies were worth their pay, the king of Strathclyde would know of their return. And even if not, he would surely have heard of the arrival of 100 tons of red sandstone arriving at Iona in the summer. In the darkness, as rain beat on the slatted wooden roof above them, dripping down the walls and seeping into the straw, she had told Constantine to get his rest for the next day, and he had moved away from her, although Osrith sensed his reluctance. They slept easily by one another, too easily, in the past. But the truth was, apart from Domnall, whom she trusted above all men, she was relieved. Osrith couldn't bear the idea of anyone touching her. How she longed for battle, against whom? She didn't care. To kill men in battle because they were her lord's enemy, that thought cheered her. For, not do so meant, ultimately, reliance in the charity of men, who may see her back to Elfric should someone figure the truth of her. She would not have her life governed by any man. Osrith's strength was returning. 88,888,888. It took nearly 2 days for the little coracles to end their oft-sail journey to Iona. Osrith had made to row, but Taggart had tied her on again, as Constantine fed her bread part way, when the sun made an appearance, as if it had burst its rays onto a meeting to which it had not been invited, and quickly scuttled away behind the thick, grey clouds above them. Osrith looked around them, over the seething grey sea, but could not see Domnall's craft, She had lost sight of them almost immediately after both boats had left the Ulster coast. But, it was there ahead of them when they finally drew to the island that eventually ahead of them, set within the backdrop of a flame-orange sky, and she felt so pleased when three figures were waiting for them. Domhnall and Fergus. Tagged was always quick to boast the epithet that the Norse and Danes were the best sailors in the world, except for the Irish. That they had crossed such a terribly ferocious sea, promising to toss them high one minute and pull them under another, Osrith could not be more in agreement. Seeing that the boats tied to the harbour, Domhnall ordered them to the monastery, where the monks, remembering them leave, on a night not unlike that one, welcomed Domhnall and his warriors, piled more wood into the fire, and before long a great blaze was growing. Osrith was shivering, but the warmth soon evaporated the water from most of her clothes. And, there was food. "We haven't a great deal," the abbot, an old man with a tonsured head in the Irish style, a shaved strip from ear to ear, explained, as a simple meal of dried fish and milk was put on the table, with a weak spirit that smelt to Osrith like a weak Uisge. "We were aided by the Norse, who have overtaken the northern islands. They have taken most of what we had stored after the harvest. At least we live." "You live," Domhnall confirmed, before inviting the seafarers to eat. None of them needed encouragement. To Osrith the grainy, off-smelling fish and the hard bread were as delicious as any meal she had ever had. She would sleep well that night. It was Domhnall who shook Osrith's shoulder the following morning as a weak, late autumn light filtered through the gaps in the wood. Heat from the fire had risen to warm the straw, and Osrith had slept well. Rubbing her face, she stared vacantly at Domhnall for a moment, before scrabbling to her feet. Domhnall would be angry with her for still being asleep. "Easy," Domhnall chuckled, handing Buet to Osrith. "Domhnall wants to see you. He is in the courtyard." Horror flooded through Osrith, and Domhnall stood, hands on hips, amused as Osrith pulled on her leather jerkin and boots, raking through her stubs of hair with her fingertips before racing down the rickety steps from the top of the barn, the exiled Irish prince behind her. But Domhnall waved her apologies away. Constantine, Tagged and Fergus were already standing in the straw-strewn courtyard, and they watched her as she stood next to Tagged, at the end of the line. Domhnall stood next to her, looking grave as Domhnall spoke. "You are to be on guard tonight, all three of you. The monks are holding a service in honor of our blessed Saint Comsil. You are to attend first for prayers. Then tomorrow—" He broke off, glancing at Constantine, who he then took by the shoulder and drew to him. Domhnall looked about them. His cousin had said nothing about Constantine. "He'll be at the service," Osrith thought. The huge, red sandstone block on a cart outside Iona's monastic doors. "He'll be with Domhnall, wanting St. Comsil to favor their victory over Giric." She watched as the two princes walked, heads together in serious discussion, across the courtyard. Clearly something concerning just them. Across their path a group of monks crossed, carrying candles, a huge book, presumably Comsil's Gospel, and two large boxes. Was their guard to do with protecting these holy men? Or maybe from the Norse? They had been given a hearty welcome the night before, and the abbot had explained they were frequently raided nowadays. Perhaps Domhnall was concerned about his stone? Not that the Viking Norse would have much use for it. Once all their valuables had been taken, though, then they would probably burn the buildings. Like in Doi Iashi, with Tagged and Fergus, and the monks' own guards, were there to prevent that. "Let's hope it doesn't rain," Fergus said, striding off in the direction of the blacksmith. "I don't want this rusted any more than it is already." "I told you to oil it," Tagged called after him, before looking up to the sky. "Sheep fleece would have done it." Osrith looked up too. It was leaden grey. Chances were that it would rain. Osrith yawned, stifling it with the back of her hand. It was strange, seeing the island in the daylight. A flat, small island, treeless, bar one yew tree growing close to the wooden stockade at the rear of the monastery, hemmed in by sea. This was what Domhnall's ancestor had gifted to Comsil of Doi centuries ago, on which to build a monastery, a base, from where he could send missionaries put to the Picts, to Christianize them. The small, raised section at the center, a natural hill, was where today's monastery sat, the grey sea differentiating itself not one jot from the sky. Her eye met the barn, and she remembered chancing on Domhnall and Finolai together on their outward way to the UNA. Copyright ill. They had energetically loved one another, and had seemed so happy, so wrapped in themselves. And now Finolai was gone. When Domhnall claimed the throne, Era would join him as his queen. "Come on," said Domhnall, pointing in the direction of the kitchens, taking Osrith by the shoulder. "Best you get a bite to eat before we have to go in." 88,888,888. The body of Saint Comsil, wrapped delicate, like white cloth, was at the altar with Domhnall on one side and Constantine the other. Both Aetildalpin princes were on their knees, in prayer, as the saint's bones were brought to them, one by one. Though it was hard to follow all of the Gaelic, some was in Latin, which Osrith knew, thanks to Father Bowker, and she sat in silence between Tagd and Domhnall as the saint, akin to Cuthbert to the Northumbrians, was adored. In the warmth of the church and the odour of the incense, Osrith's mind began to wander. She thought of the only story Bowker had ever told her of the saint. Columba appeared in a dream to King Oswald of Bernicia, and announced the king's forthcoming victory against the King Cadwallon of Wales in the Battle of Heavenfield against the pagan King Penda of Mercia. The people of Britain promised to convert to Christianity and receive baptism after the conclusion of the war. This victory signalled a re-Christianizing of pagan England, Bowker had concluded, closing the chapel's annals with a heavy thump. He had turned to Osrith and added, "And this established King Oswald as ruler of the entirety of Britain. Your ancestor." And, then, Bowker had glanced at the door, as if expecting Elfric to enter. He drew Osrith forward by the shoulder, looking at her seriously and lowering both his voice and his shoulders. "Remember that, Edra," he'd cautioned. "Your ancestor ruled the Heptarchy. He already did what Alfred of Wessex aspires to do. And that is why his niece, Oswy's daughter Osrith, chose to have his remains collected from the battlefield and buried in the Merson monastery of Bardsey. He was as revered to the Mersons as Cuthbert was to the Northumbrians, and Columba, Comsil, was to the Gaels. Osrith, her ancestor, whose name had come to mind when she had faced Maxenid Aetildalpin that day, having rescued Constantine, had been so brave. Osrith, as Edra, had read her story, how she had married the first King Ethliad, Penda's youngest son, as a political Northumbrian Merson pact to strengthen the one between her older sister and Ethliad's older brother, Wulfhere. But it didn't last, and the sons of Penda were regularly facing Osrith's brother, Ecgfrith, on battlefields along the Northumbrian Merson border. Yet she had been loyal to Mercia, and for that, had been murdered in revenge for her sister's betrayal of the Merson nobility, and had allowed assassins to do their worst on the royal family one fateful night. A tap on the shoulder brought Osrith out of her memories. Domhnall's voice was warm by her ear. "We must be in guard duty now." Osrith looked at the monks, who were still in mid-flow of the service. Domhnall too looked like he hadn't moved since he had knelt there. Constantine too was the stillest she had ever seen him. She got to her feet, Tagd and Fergus following her over the fresh, straw-strewn floors. Clearly no one was taking the praising of Comsil frivolously, a fact which was reinforced when no one stopped to look at them. Clearly it was vital to everyone there that the service was to be carried out as intended. A few words between Domhnall and one of the monks who had been on the earlier guard duty established the areas to watch. Norse had been spotted further north, so the harbour and the high ground were to be guarded, as the land facing the forest from the ramparts for anyone loyal to Eochaid and Gerrick. That was to be Osrith's guard with two monks, her back to the sea and the cold Atlantic wind. She climbed the wooden steps, curling her feet around the planks to stop herself from slipping on the damp wood. Behind her, Domhnall trod. He was to take the rampart at the northern end, where the wooden posts gave way to cold earth and now, dense fog. But first, he stood, 6 feet away from her, back to the wooden posts, his eyes west, to his homeland. Osrith felt her heart soften. He was clearly as fearsome and determined for power as his cousins, and he had lost his position as Constantine and Domhnall had done. She should despise him for the disdain and scorn he had shown her, attacking her, trying to rape her the coward's way, held down, holding her again as Don Chada cut her hair. She had thought they were going to burn her on that fire, but they hadn't. Still, the whiteness of flame came to her mind when Domnall was near. He had shown that he could be frightening. But now, he was simply a young warrior, set on finding his illused sister. And so the hatred, such that she felt for Elfric, was almost entirely absent towards Domnall Macht. He treated her with friendly tolerance afterwards, being accepting of her position next to Domnall after her protection of the princes and princesses, his brothers and cousins, when the Norse had attacked. And like any clansman, determined to protect all that was his or his family's, had followed her to the beach that day, when she had taken the lily route, and rescued her just before she drowned. Constantine, though just a few years younger than Domnall had, instead, fled. She shivered, remembering Nine Fingers' attack and Flansinna's treaty with the Allied. Constantine told me about Flan and Don Chada, Osrith said, when Domnall hadn't moved. She turned her head, hair a little longer than it had been, those few months before, now whipping by her ears. Domnall did not move his head, but nodded once, in the now hastening twilight. Muir said she would flee Ailch to Dunotter with the boys if the situation worsened. Domnall has sworn to accept her, assuming he wins. He sighed deeply, and looked at Osrith. And you? She watched his pale face, framed with long black hair, freeze, as if solidified by the cold, incessant wind-up in the wooden ramparts. I will serve Domnall. I will search for Ethan, and keep her with me when I found her, no matter what. She was a queen, once. And I will never give up claim my father's throne. He looked past her, and down towards the chapel. If winning is proportional to prayer, there is no doubt Domnall will succeed, Osrith replied, as Fergus's rain dropped in light spats onto her head. Domnall gave her a wry smile. Maybe Comsil will help him. But Ailch, Doia, my war is a war between you and Atilda copyright ills, between the descendants of Neil no Agawalach, of the 9 hostages. Since that time, St. Comsil was your ancestor? Osrith asked, as the rain began to fall steadily in big, sopping drips. He sailed from Doia, as we did, and was gifted Iona. Then, Oswy of Northumbria wanted an Iona of his own. It was Oswald, Osrith mentally corrected him, Osrith of Old's uncle, not Osrith's brother. And that place had been Lindisfarne, Lindisfarne. She would have said so too, only Domnall had lapsed into silence. Comsil was the ancestor of all no Agawalach's descendants. Even the Allied the Saint would have to decide who to favour. So, if Tfindlaith's eldest was to stage a battle for his father's throne, he would need men, as Domnall had, not only fighters, large numbers as he had once drilled so early in the mornings at Doia, but also warriors, loyal because they knew the king would be loyal to them. And Domnall had already proved that he was loyal to his family by recovering Osrith. Had she not sworn to Domnall, she may easily have knelt to fealty to Domnall. And you? Domnall asked suddenly, his face coursing with rain. What do you want? For this bloody rain to stop, Osrith replied. Domnall's lips turned up at the corners. Marriage. You are 14. Girls marry at 13 or 14. Not me, Osrith replied, watching, amused, at the conflicting emotions on his face. I will not marry, Prince Domnall, for no man will abide me as a warrior. He looked thoughtful for a moment, and looked as if he was about to say something other than that which he did. No, he agreed. Men need wives for children. I would need a mother of my children, not a warrior. Osrith thought of the servant girl, from whom Mary helped birth his son. What was that babe doing now? Did he thrive? Would Domnall ever acknowledge him? You may not always feel like you wish to be a warrior. You may change your mind. Osrith turned to him. Will you? Number. Which is why I will never marry, Osrith concluded, satisfied she had made her point. The only thing I want is to be a warrior. If it means I am no longer a woman, to never give birth, so be it. Osrith expected Domnall to leave the conversation there, turn to go to his own guard duty, but instead, the Aelch prince pressed on. "And you and Constantine?" Osrith swallowed. What had Constantine told his cousin Aeledi about them? She decided to be honest. "It is hard to explain," Osrith conceded, the rain easing a little as the dusk sky darkened to inky blue in Irian's direction. "Do you know I saved his life?" Domhnall nodded. "And, in a way, he saved mine after my family were murdered. I don't know where I'd be if King Constantine's father hadn't taken me in as a servant, or if Sened's captain of the household guard hadn't trained me." "You like to fight?" "Truly, it is terrifying, at first, but then, you don't notice," Osrith admitted. "I can be on the receiving end of a sword, women still die at the sword, but I get a far better chance of living now am I trained to use one." "But you truly like to fight?" he repeated. "Were that I had been born a boy," Osrith replied, wistfully. Domhnall pressed his conversation no more. Chanting from the monastery filled the night air, and turned, treading the wet wooden planks to his station. 88,888,888. It was a long night, and for the passing of the cold air, nothing moved. The monastery was now lit with candles, whose light leaked out into the mist from its windows and doors, and Osrith bided the hours by walking slowly around the inner palisade defenses, waiting for attack, if there was to be one. The moon rose, and carried on rising, until it was overhead, its silvery light blending with the gold from the monastery's light, and she glanced over to the door, through which the procession of monks, led by the abbot, who were joining Domhnall and Constantine. By the door, to the south, the light lit Fergus's flame-colored hair, turning it silver, as the warrior stood stoically, reliably, in the damp of the night. To the east, Osrith knew, Tagd would be doing the same. How long did they intend to remain inside? Did it really take all these hours to get the saint's attention? A crack brought her attention to the cold, damp night, then another. Around the wooden ramparts, where monks were guarding, up high, a movement caught her attention. They had been attracted by something. The men hurried to the side of one who had flinched. Rain began to spat in big drops on Osrith's leather jerkin as she strode over the courtyard. The men were unable to see what caused the disturbance, for they moved left and right. Osrith stopped, hearing foot crunches softly on the damp earth beyond. "Domhnall," Osrith hissed, when she doubled back to where Constantine's cousin stood on guard, to the west, near the harbour. "Osrith." His voice sounded surprised, and there was a warm tone to it that hadn't been there earlier. "I was about to find you." "Me?" Osrith felt surprised, and suddenly forgot why she sought him. "Come with me to the monastery for the night prayers. Domhnall's service is still in progress. The guards won't miss us for a little time. We can add to the prayers to Comsil." "But," Osrith shook her head, to get her attention onto her reason of finding him. "There's intruders," she blurted out. "Someone at the north gate." Without hesitation the Irish prince sprang to his feet, pacing with her to the ramparts, then put an arm across her to stop her from moving when he, too, heard the sound of more than one pair of boots, of shuffling of people trying to be as quiet as they could. "Domhnall," Osrith hissed to Domhnall, but the prince caught her upper arm. "They are still at prayer," Domhnall reminded her. But she pointed, urgently, back the way she came. Domhnall trod the damp, leaf-litter floor next to Osrith. They ran around the palisade until they reached the place underneath where she had been guarding. Large drops of water splashed down off the wooden surface, and she held up a hand as the crunching and muffled voices were unmistakable. They were those of people trying their very best not to be heard. The ground tilted away between two shallow hills. These men knew what they were doing, where to hide for a surprise attack. Were they Norse? Likely, for there had been many yearly raids on the monastery. Yet the Norse would have often announced their arrival by now, frightening their enemies with show of strength before even raising an axe. Several words drifted upwards, many snippets of words, too indistinct to make out. It didn't sound like Norse, though some of the phrases caught on the wind and sounded Cymric and Gaelish. Cymric and Gaelish, Osrith thought. These were an alliance of different peoples of Alba, an alliance that were ambushing the holiest of monasteries at night. when Domnall, son of Constantine, grandson of Saint Mac-Tildilpin, prayed for victory in St. Columba's house. How were they to do this? The ground sloped away, and the monks guarding the monastery had not accounted for such an hiding place to be occupied by a large force planning to attack. If there wasn't, they would be no worse off. Osrith pointed down, and Domnall nodded. He knew what she meant. AMD moved to the left, and over the rampart he would bring the warriors to fight, to guard the weak point. Osrith looked about her. What could she do? She could fight. Yes, she had Buoy. But was there a way of surprising the attackers? Beyond the ramparts a cluster of half a dozen trees grew, huddled together as if warming themselves from the cold Atlantic winds that battered the island's coasts. If she climbed those, she might be seen. Ordinarily, it was dark enough that she would likely get away with, and she could only fight. Yet, her blade was in her scabbard. It would be a mistake to charge out without a coordinated force. Yet, they must do something. She scanned the land in the foreground. There it was, their mistake. It was a mistake to attempt to assault the monastery from where they were, for a rau tree, unusual for the Western Isles for them to even exist. Branches densely clustered despite there being only half a dozen or of them. The prevailing west coasterly winds had permanently battered them together, and though it was mid-November and the leaves had thoroughly left them, their packed together form should, offer cover. She kicked at the parapet, to get Domnall's attention, who turned his long neck from craning over the wooden wall down to monks in the courtyard, who tore off towards the chapel, hair plastered to his head by the rain. Looked at Osrith. She motioned to the trees and, after a few seconds, the prince nodded, understanding.